The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for the final time. 23 years he had served as a Queen's Guard, and never once had he broken protocol. His polished black boots gleamed in the early light, and his tall bearskin hat sat perfectly straight on his head. Today was supposed to be like any other day of ceremonial duty. James had earned his position through years of dedicated service in the British Army. He had served tours in Afghanistan and Iraq before being selected for the prestigious role of protecting the royal family. The training was rigorous, the standards impossibly high, and the expectations crystal clear. Remain motionless, silent, and vigilant at all times while on duty. Breaking these rules could mean immediate dismissal and the end of a military career. The palace grounds were already buzzing with activity as tourists began gathering for the changing of the guard ceremony. James took his position at the main entrance, his rifle held at the present arms position. His fellow guards moved into their assigned spots with practiced precision. The routine was so familiar he could perform it in his sleep. Among the crowd, gathering that Tuesday morning was the Henderson family from Manchester. Sarah Henderson pushed her 8-year-old son Tommy in his wheelchair, while her husband Mark walked beside them carrying a small backpack filled with medical supplies. Tommy had been born with spina bifida, a condition that affected his mobility and required him to use a wheelchair. Despite his challenges, Tommy was a bright, cheerful boy with an infectious smile and an obsession with anything related to the military. Tommy had been talking about this trip for months. His bedroom walls were covered with pictures of soldiers, tanks, and especially the famous Queen's Guards in their red uniforms. He knew everything there was to know about their history, their uniforms, and their duties. His parents had saved for over a year to make this dream trip to London possible, knowing how much it meant to their son. As the family approached the palace gates, Tommy's excitement was obvious to everyone around them. His eyes grew wide as he saw the guards in their ceremonial positions. He whispered to his mother about the different parts of their uniforms, pointing out details that most tourists would never notice. This was the moment he had been waiting for his entire young life. The crowd grew thicker as more tourists arrived. People jostled for the best viewing positions, phones and cameras ready to capture the famous ceremony. In the midst of all this excitement, nobody noticed the small mechanical problem developing with Tommy's wheelchair. A loose bolt in the wheel mechanism had been gradually working itself free during the journey from their hotel. James maintained his stoic expression and rigid posture as required, but his trained eye continuously scanned the crowd for any potential security threats. Years of military service had taught him to notice details that others might miss. He observed the usual mix of tourists: families with children, elderly couples, groups of students, and solo travelers from around the world. As the ceremony time approached, the crowd pressed closer to the gates. Tommy's parents tried to position his wheelchair where he could get a clear view of the proceedings, but the dense crowd made it difficult. Taller adults blocked his view, and his wheelchair couldn't easily navigate through the packed bodies of tourists all vying for the perfect photo opportunity. The boy's disappointment was beginning to show on his face as he realized he might not be able to see the guards clearly. His mother bent down to whisper encouraging words, promising they would find a better spot, but the crowd seemed to grow denser by the minute. Mark tried to push the wheelchair to different positions, but each spot seemed to have its own obstacles. James noticed the family's struggle from his position. In all his years of service, he had seen countless tourists, but something about this particular boy caught his attention. Perhaps it was the child's obvious knowledge and enthusiasm for military tradition, or maybe it was the way his parents were trying so hard to make this experience special for him. The morning was proceeding, exactly as planned until the moment that would change everything. As Tommy's father attempted to reposition the wheelchair one more time, the loose bolt finally gave way completely. The wheel seized up suddenly, causing the chair to jolt to an abrupt stop. The sudden movement threw Tommy forward slightly, and, while his safety straps prevented him from falling, the wheelchair was now completely immobilized. Tommy's face immediately showed confusion and worry as he realized something was wrong with his chair. His parents quickly assessed the situation, with Mark kneeling beside the wheelchair to examine the broken wheel mechanism. The bolt had fallen out completely and rolled away, lost among the feet of the surrounding tourists. Sarah knelt beside her son, trying to reassure him that everything would be okay, but her own concern was evident in her voice. They were in a foreign city, surrounded by strangers, with a broken wheelchair and a disappointed child who had been looking forward to this moment for so long. The ceremony was about to begin, and it seemed like Tommy's dream of seeing the guards up close was slipping away. The crowd around them began to take notice of the situation, with some tourists offering sympathetic looks and others seeming annoyed by the disruption. A few people offered to help, but nobody had the tools or knowledge needed to fix the wheelchair's mechanical problem. From his position 20 feet away, James watched the entire situation unfold. His military training had taught him to assess problems quickly and take decisive action when necessary. He could see the distress on the child's face and the helpless frustration of the parents. In that moment, something stirred within him that was stronger than 23 years of rigid protocol and military discipline. James felt his heart rate increase as he watched the Henderson family's desperate situation unfold before him. Every instinct he had developed over 2 decades of military service told him to help, but his duty as a Queen's Guard demanded absolute stillness and silence. The internal conflict was unlike anything he had experienced during his years of service. The rules governing the Queen's Guard were not mere suggestions, but sacred traditions dating back centuries. Guards were expected to remain motionless for hours, ignoring distractions, weather, and even physical discomfort. They were trained to treat tourists as invisible, never acknowledging questions, requests for photos, or attempts to make them break character. The penalties for breaking protocol were severe: immediate removal from duty, potential court-martial, and the permanent end of a military career. Tommy's situation was growing more distressing by the minute. His parents had managed to examine the wheelchair more closely and discovered that without the bolt, the wheel was completely seized. Mark had tried using coins and his keys to jerry-rig a temporary solution, but nothing worked. The wheelchair was effectively broken, and Tommy was stranded in the middle of an increasingly impatient crowd. Other tourists began taking photos and videos of the family's predicament, some out of genuine concern, but others seemingly viewing it as entertainment. Sarah noticed the cameras pointed at her son and felt a surge of protective anger, but she couldn't do anything about it while trying to comfort Tommy and help her husband figure out a solution. Tommy himself was trying to be brave, but tears were beginning to form in his eyes. This was supposed to be the best day of his life, the culmination of months of excited planning and anticipation. Instead, he was stuck in a broken wheelchair, unable to see the guards he had dreamed about meeting, while strangers took pictures of his misfortune. From his rigid position, James could see every detail of the boy's distress. He noticed how Tommy kept looking toward the guards with longing, how his small hands gripped the armrests of his wheelchair in frustration, and how his parents were trying to hide their own panic while maintaining encouraging smiles for their son. The ceremony was scheduled to begin in less than 10 minutes. James knew that once it started, the crowd would surge forward for better views, potentially making Tommy's situation even worse. The family would likely be forced to leave, and the boy would go home having never experienced the moment he had traveled so far to see. James began to feel something he had never experienced during his guard duty: a personal connection to someone in the crowd. Perhaps it was Tommy's obvious respect and knowledge of military tradition, or maybe it was the way the boy was trying so hard to be brave despite his disappointment. Whatever it was, James found himself unable to simply ignore. the situation as his training demanded. Meanwhile, Tommy's condition was starting to affect him physically as well as emotionally. The stress and disappointment were triggering some of the medical issues associated with his spina bifida. Sarah noticed the warning signs and began digging through their medical bag, realizing they might need to leave not just because of the broken wheelchair, but because Tommy needed medical attention. The crowd around them was becoming restless as the ceremony's start time approached. Some tourists were openly expressing annoyance at the disruption, while others were trying to be helpful, but getting in the way. A few people had attempted to contact palace security, but the guards at the gates were focused on the ceremonial preparations and crowd control for the main event. James watched as Sarah whispered something to her husband, and he saw Mark's expression change to one of deeper concern. They were clearly discussing whether they needed to leave immediately for Tommy's health and safety. The dream trip that had taken a year to plan and save for was about to end in complete disappointment. In that moment, James made a decision that would define the rest of his military career. He began to move his eyes, scanning the immediate area for his commanding officer. This small action was itself a violation of protocol, but he needed to assess whether he could act without being immediately stopped. His sergeant major was positioned about 50 feet away, focused on coordinating with other guards for the ceremony. The other guards in James's immediate vicinity were locked in their ceremonial positions, eyes forward, completely focused on their duties. James realized he had perhaps 60 seconds before someone in authority would notice any deviation from protocol. The weight of his decision pressed down on him like a physical force. Everything he had worked for in his military career was about to be put at risk for a boy he had never met. His pension, his reputation, his standing in the regiment, all of it could disappear in the next few minutes. But as he looked at Tommy's face, seeing the disappointment and growing physical distress, James knew he couldn't live with himself if he did nothing. Taking a deep breath that no one could see beneath his rigid exterior, James began to make his move. First, he slowly shifted his rifle position, a movement so subtle that most observers wouldn't notice, but that represented a complete break from his ceremonial stance. Tommy, despite his distress, was still watching the guards with fascination. He was the first person to notice that one of the guards seemed to be moving slightly differently than the others. His tear-filled eyes widened as he realized that the guard was looking directly at him, making eye contact in a way that he knew was not supposed to happen. Sarah noticed her son's sudden change in attention and followed his gaze to see the guard, who was clearly focused on their situation. She felt a mixture of hope and concern, knowing that what she was witnessing was unprecedented but not sure what it might mean for her family or for the guard himself. James took his final mental inventory of the consequences he was about to face, then made his choice. With movements that were careful but deliberate, he began to step out of his ceremonial position, breaking 23 years of perfect protocol adherence for an 8-year-old boy he had never spoken to, but who had somehow reached through decades of military discipline to touch his heart. The moment James took his first step out of formation, a ripple of shock went through the nearby crowd. Tourists who had been focused on getting the perfect photo suddenly found themselves witnessing something they had never seen before, and likely never would again. Camera phones turned toward him as people realized they were watching a Queen's Guard break the most fundamental rule of his duty. James felt the weight of every eye upon him as he moved with measured steps toward the Henderson family. His heart pounded against his chest, but his military training kept his movements controlled and purposeful. He could hear the whispers and gasps from the crowd, could see the confusion and amazement on faces around him, but he kept his focus on Tommy and his parents. Tommy's eyes grew wide with disbelief as the tall figure in the red tunic and towering bearskin hat approached his wheelchair. The boy had read about the Queen's Guards, knew their history and traditions, and understood exactly how extraordinary this moment was. Despite his physical discomfort and disappointment, he felt a surge of excitement that made his heart race. Sarah, instinctively moved protectively closer to her son, not out of fear, but from maternal instinct when faced with such an unprecedented situation. She had no idea what to expect, or what the guard's intentions might be. Mark stood up from beside the wheelchair, his mouth slightly open in amazement at what he was witnessing. As James reached the family, he did something that made the growing crowd gasp collectively. He removed his bearskin hat. This simple action was perhaps even more shocking than leaving his post, as the ceremonial hat was an integral part of the guard's uniform and was never to be removed while on duty. He tucked the hat under his left arm and looked down at Tommy with gentle eyes that showed none of the stern, unseeing expression guards were trained to maintain. "Hello there, soldier," James said quietly, his voice carrying a warmth that cut through the noise of the surrounding crowd. The use of the word soldier was deliberate and meaningful, recognizing Tommy's obvious respect for and knowledge of military tradition. Tommy's mouth fell open, and for a moment he couldn't speak. When he finally found his voice, it came out, as barely a whisper. "You're not supposed to talk to me." James smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his entire appearance from the stoic, ceremonial figure into a kind, approachable man. "You're right, I'm not. But sometimes there are more important things than following every rule." He glanced at Tommy's parents, noting their mixture of gratitude and concern. "I'm Sergeant James Mitchell, and I couldn't help but notice you folks are having some trouble." Mark found his voice first among the adults. "The wheelchair broke. The wheel seized up and we can't fix it without the right tools. We're supposed to leave for home this afternoon, and Tommy has been looking forward to seeing the ceremony for months." James knelt down beside the wheelchair, bringing himself to Tommy's eye level. The crowd pressed closer, phones and cameras capturing every moment of this unprecedented interaction. "What's your name, son?" "Tommy," the boy replied, his voice gaining strength as he realized this was really happening. "Tommy Henderson. I know everything about the Queen's Guards. I know about the Battle of Waterloo and why you wear the bearskin hats and how long you have to stand still and everything." "Is that right?" James replied, genuinely impressed by the boy's enthusiasm and knowledge. "Well then, you know how important our duties are, don't you?" Tommy nodded seriously. "That's why I don't understand why you're talking to me. Won't you get in trouble?" The honesty and concern in the boy's question touched James deeply. Here was a child who was so respectful of military tradition that even in his moment of disappointment, he was worried about a stranger getting in trouble for helping him. "Probably," James admitted. "But you know what, Tommy? Sometimes being a good soldier means knowing when to break the rules for the right reasons." By now, other guards had noticed the situation. James could see his sergeant major pushing through the crowd, his face showing a mixture of anger, confusion, and concern. He knew he had perhaps 2 or 3 more minutes before he would be forcibly removed from the situation, so he had to act. "Quickly, let me take a look at this wheelchair," James said, examining the broken mechanism. His military training included basic mechanical repair, and he could see exactly what was wrong. The bolt had indeed fallen out completely, but the threading was still intact. "I think I might be able to help with this." James reached into one of the pockets of his tunic and pulled out a small multi-tool that guards were allowed to carry for uniform adjustments and minor repairs. Among its attachments was a small bolt that looked like it might be the right size for the wheelchair's wheel assembly. "This might work," he said, showing the bolt to Mark. "It's not exactly the right size, but it should hold long enough for you to see the ceremony and get to a proper repair shop." As James began working on the wheelchair, Tommy watched every movement with fascination. "Are you going to get fired?" the boy asked with the direct honesty that only children possess. James paused in his work and looked at Tommy seriously. "I might lose my job, yes. But Tommy, some things are more important than jobs. Making sure a young man who clearly understands and respects what we do gets to see the ceremony he traveled so far for, That's one of those things. The crowd around them had grown substantially, with people calling others over to witness the unprecedented scene. Videos were being recorded and shared on social media, with hashtags already beginning to trend. Palace security was moving through the crowd, but they seemed as unsure about how to handle the situation as everyone else. Sarah knelt down beside the guard and her son. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice thick with emotion. "You have no idea what this means to him, to our family." James looked up from his repair work and met her eyes. "Actually, I think I do. I have a nephew about Tommy's age. He's been asking to visit me at work for 2 years, but I've never been able to arrange it because of security protocols. Seeing Tommy's excitement, his respect for what we do, it reminds me why I chose this job in the first place." With a final adjustment, James tightened the makeshift bolt into place. The wheel turned smoothly, and the wheelchair was functional again. "There we go," he said, standing up and brushing off his uniform. "That should hold you for the rest of the day." Tommy tested the wheelchair controls, and a huge smile spread across his face as it moved properly. "It works! Mom, Dad, it works!" He looked up at James with an expression of pure joy and gratitude. "Thank you, Sergeant Mitchell. This is the best day of my life." James felt a warmth in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years of military service. At that moment, he knew that regardless of the consequences he was about to face, he had made the right choice. Sergeant Major William Brooks pushed through the crowd with the determination of a man who had spent 30 years maintaining military discipline. His face was stern as he approached the unprecedented scene unfolding before him, but as he got closer, he could see something that made him pause. The genuine joy on Tommy's face and the obvious emotional impact on everyone present. "Sergeant Mitchell," the sergeant major called out in a voice that carried both authority and confusion. The crowd immediately quieted, sensing that the moment of reckoning had arrived. James stood at attention, his bearskin hat still tucked, under his arm, facing his superior officer with the bearing of a soldier ready to accept whatever consequences awaited him. "Sir," James replied formally, his military training taking over even in this extraordinary situation. Brooks looked at the wheelchair, now functioning properly, then at Tommy's beaming face, then at the crowd of tourists who were watching with mixture of fascination and concern. This was unlike any situation he had encountered in his decades of service, and the manual didn't exactly cover what to do when one of your guards breaks protocol to help a disabled child. "What exactly is happening here, Sergeant?" Brooks asked, though he could see the situation clearly enough. Before James could respond, Tommy spoke up with the clarity and honesty that only children possess. "Sir, my wheelchair broke and I couldn't see the ceremony, and Sergeant Mitchell fixed it for me. He said he might get in trouble, but that some things are more important than rules." The sergeant major looked down at the boy, taking in his obvious respect for military tradition and his genuine concern for James. Brooks had children of his own, and grandchildren too, and he recognized the look of a child who had just experienced something magical. Sarah Henderson stepped forward, her voice shaking slightly with emotion. "Please don't punish him. We didn't ask him to help us. He just saw that our son was in trouble and chose to do something kind. Tommy has been planning this trip for months, and your sergeant just made his dreams come true." The crowd around them murmured in agreement, and Brooks could feel the weight of public opinion settling on the situation. But more than that, he could see something in James's eyes that he had never seen in 23 years of serving together. A sense of purpose that went beyond duty and protocol. Brooks made a decision that would surprise everyone present. "Sergeant Mitchell, return to your position. We'll discuss this later." His voice was stern, but there was something else in it that James couldn't quite identify. As James began to move back toward his post, Tommy called out to him, "Sergeant Mitchell, will I see you after the ceremony?" James looked at his superior officer questioningly. Brooks gave an almost imperceptible nod. "I'll be right here, Tommy. You enjoy the ceremony." The crowd began to disperse slightly as the guards returned to their positions, but many people lingered, having witnessed something they knew was special. Social media was already buzzing with videos and photos of the interaction, with captions like "Queen's Guard breaks protocol to help disabled child," and "This is what real heroism looks like." Tommy's parents positioned his wheelchair in a spot where he had a perfect view of the ceremony area. His excitement was infectious, and other tourists began making space around his wheelchair, ensuring he wouldn't miss anything. The broken wheel incident had turned into an unexpected blessing, as Tommy now had better access than they had originally hoped for. As the ceremony began, James returned to his rigid position, but something had changed. The crowd was looking at him differently now, not just as a silent, stoic figure in a uniform, but as a human being who had shown extraordinary kindness. Tourist photos now included him specifically, and he could hear whispers of admiration and respect from passers-by. Tommy watched the entire ceremony with rapt attention, his eyes following every movement, every detail of the precisely choreographed tradition. He whispered commentary to his parents about the significance of various elements, his encyclopedic knowledge making the experience even richer for everyone around him. During the ceremony, word of what had happened began spreading beyond just the tourists present. Palace staff members heard about the incident, and within an hour, it had reached the attention of senior officials. Social media posts were being shared thousands of times, with people around the world praising James's actions and expressing hope that he wouldn't face serious consequences. When the ceremony concluded, Tommy's family approached James's position one more time. The official proceedings were over, but James maintained his formal stance, unsure of what protocols now applied to his unprecedented situation. "Sergeant Mitchell," Tommy called out, his voice filled with happiness. "That was the most amazing thing I've ever seen. Thank you for making it possible." James allowed himself a small smile, though he kept his eyes forward. "It was my pleasure, Tommy. You're a credit to young people everywhere." Mark Henderson shook his head in amazement. "We'll never forget this. Tommy will be talking about today for the rest of his life." As the family began to leave, Tommy had one more thing to say. "Sergeant Mitchell, I want to be a soldier like you when I grow up. Not just because of the uniform or the ceremony, but because you showed me that the best soldiers are the ones who help people when they need it most." Brooks, who had been observing from a distance, approached James as the crowds began to thin. "Sergeant, you're needed in the office immediately." James nodded, knowing that the moment of accountability had arrived. As they walked toward the administrative building, Brooks spoke quietly. "You know what you did was completely against regulations." "Yes, sir," James replied. "You also know that your actions have been recorded and shared all over the internet." "Yes, sir." Brooks stopped walking and turned to face James directly. "What you might not know is that in the past 2 hours, we've received over 500 messages from people around the world praising your actions. The video has been viewed more than 50,000 times, and every single comment I've seen has been positive." James looked surprised. He had been so focused on the potential consequences that he hadn't considered the possibility of public support. "We've also received a call from Buckingham Palace," Brooks continued. "It seems word of your actions has reached some very high places, and there are people who want to meet with you about what happened today." As they entered the building, James realized that his spontaneous decision to help Tommy had set in motion a chain of events that would extend far beyond a simple disciplinary action. The question now was not just what would happen to his career, but how this moment of human kindness would ripple outward into something much larger than he had ever imagined. The administrative office felt unusually tense as James sat across from Sergeant Major Brooks and Colonel Patricia Whitmore, the regiment's commanding officer. Colonel Whitmore was known throughout the regiment as a strict disciplinarian who valued tradition and protocol above all else. James had rarely interacted with her directly, but her reputation preceded her as someone who did not tolerate deviation from established procedures. "Sergeant Mitchell," Colonel Whitmore began, her voice measured and professional, "in 27 years of military service, I have never encountered a situation quite like this one. Your actions today represent a clear and deliberate violation of standing orders, ceremonial protocol, and centuries of military tradition." James sat at attention, his hands placed precisely on his knees, his eyes focused straight ahead. "Yes, ma'am. I understand the seriousness of my actions." "Do you?" she asked, leaning forward slightly. "Because I'm not sure you fully grasp the implications of what you've done. The Queen's Guard represents the dignity and unchanging nature of the monarchy. When you broke formation, you didn't just violate a rule, you broke a sacred trust." The weight of her words settled heavily in the room. James felt the full magnitude of his decision pressing down on him, and for a moment he wondered if his impulse to help Tommy had been worth the destruction of everything he had worked for throughout his military career. Colonel Whitmore continued, "However, I would be remiss if I didn't also acknowledge the unprecedented public response to your actions." She gestured to a tablet on her desk. "In the past 4 hours, this video has been viewed over 500,000 times. We've received messages from veterans, military families, disability advocates, and ordinary citizens from around the world expressing support for what you did." James allowed himself a glance at the colonel's face, trying to read her expression. Her stern demeanor hadn't changed, but there was something in her eyes that suggested the conversation might not go in the direction he had expected. "We've also received a call from St. James's Palace," she continued. "It appears that certain members of the royal family have become aware of the situation and have requested a full report on the incident." Sergeant Major Brooks spoke up for the first time since entering the office. "Ma'am, if I may, Sergeant Mitchell's service record is exemplary. 23 years without a single disciplinary action, multiple commendations for service in combat zones, and consistent ratings as one of our most reliable and professional guards." Colonel Whitmore nodded acknowledgement of Brooks's comments, then turned her attention back to James. "Sergeant, I want to understand your thinking. What made you decide to abandon your post and break protocol?" For the first time since the conversation began, James allowed some emotion to enter his voice. "Ma'am, I saw a child who clearly respected and understood military tradition, who had traveled a great distance to witness the ceremony, and who was in distress through no fault of his own. I made a judgment call that helping him was more important than maintaining my position." "And you were willing to sacrifice your career for a stranger?" James considered the question carefully before responding. "Ma'am, I became a soldier to serve and protect others. In that moment, I felt that serving meant helping that boy, regardless of the personal cost to me." Colonel Whitmore stood up and walked to the window overlooking the courtyard where the incident had taken place. "Sergeant Mitchell, what you did today was unprecedented, unauthorized, and completely contrary to established procedures." She paused, and James braced himself for the inevitable consequences. "It was also," she continued, "one of the most genuinely heroic acts I have witnessed in my military career." James felt his heart skip a beat. This was not the direction he had expected the conversation to take. She turned back to face him. "The Queen's Guard exists to protect and serve the royal family and, by extension, the people of this nation. Today, you embodied that service in a way that has touched hearts around the world and reminded everyone of the human compassion that should underlie all military service." Colonel Whitmore returned to her seat. "That being said, we cannot simply ignore the violation of protocol. The military depends on discipline and adherence to orders. If we overlooked this completely, it would set a dangerous precedent." James nodded, understanding that some form of consequence was still inevitable. "Therefore," the colonel continued, You will receive an official reprimand in your service record for breaking formation without authorization. However, you will also receive a commendation for exceptional service and humanitarian action that reflects positively on the entire regiment. Brooks looked as surprised as James felt. A reprimand and a commendation simultaneously was almost unheard of in military bureaucracy. Furthermore, Colonel Whitmore added, I have been asked to inform you that you and your family have been invited to attend a reception at St. James's Palace next week, where you will be formally recognized for your actions today. James felt overwhelmed by the unexpected turn of events. Ma'am, I don't know what to say. Say nothing yet, she replied with what might have been the hint of a smile. There's more. We've been contacted by several news organizations requesting interviews, and the palace would like to arrange a formal photo opportunity with you and young Tommy Henderson. It seems your moment of compassion has become something of a symbol for the human side of military service. The colonel stood up again, signaling that the formal part of the meeting was concluding. Sergeant Mitchell, you put me in an impossible position today. You forced me to choose between rigid adherence to protocol and recognition of genuine human decency. I'm glad that in this case, we found a way to honor both. As James prepared to leave, Colonel Whitmore had one final comment. The Henderson family has requested permission to send you a letter of thanks. I've approved it, and I believe you'll find it quite moving. That young man has been telling everyone who will listen about the soldier who cared more about helping people than following rules. Walking out of the administrative building, James felt like he was moving through a dream. In the span of a few hours, he had gone from expecting the end of his career to being celebrated as an example of military service at its finest. His phone had been buzzing constantly with messages from fellow soldiers, friends, and family members who had seen the viral video. As he checked his messages, he found dozens of supportive notes, including one from his nephew who wrote, Uncle James, now I understand why you love being a soldier. You're my hero. The ripple effects of his decision to help Tommy were spreading far beyond anything he had imagined, and James was beginning to realize that sometimes the most important victories are the ones that have nothing to do with following orders and everything to do with following your heart. 1 week later, James stood in the ornate reception room at St. James's Palace, wearing his dress uniform with its newly added commendation ribbon. The room was filled with dignitaries, palace officials, and members of the press, but his attention was focused on the Henderson family as they entered through the grand doorway. Tommy's wheelchair had been properly repaired, and he was wearing his best clothes for the occasion. His face lit up when he saw James, and despite the formal setting, he called out excitedly, Sergeant Mitchell, I can't believe we're in a real palace! Sarah and Mark Henderson looked overwhelmed by the grandeur of their surroundings, but their pride in their son and gratitude toward James was evident in their expressions. They had spent the past week fielding interview requests and messages from people around the world who had been touched by the story of the guard who broke protocol to help their child. The past 7 days had been a whirlwind for James as well. The video of his interaction with Tommy had been viewed over 2 million times and shared across every major social media platform. News outlets from dozens of countries had covered the story, with headlines like, The Guard Who Chose Compassion, Over Protocol, and When Breaking Rules is the Right Thing to Do. More importantly to James, he had received hundreds of letters from military families, veterans, and people with disabilities who had been inspired by his actions. One letter from a retired soldier who had lost his leg in Afghanistan, particularly, moved him. You reminded all of us that the best soldiers are those who never forget their humanity, even in uniform. As the reception began, James found himself introduced to several members of the royal family. Princess Anne, known for her own military service and support of charitable causes, spoke with him personally about the importance of military personnel who understand that service means more than just following orders. Sergeant Mitchell, she said warmly, What you did exemplifies the very best of British military tradition. Rules and protocols exist for good reasons, but wisdom lies in knowing when compassion must take precedence. The formal ceremony was brief but meaningful. James received a special recognition award for extraordinary humanitarian service while representing the Crown, while Tommy was presented with an honorary certificate acknowledging his exemplary knowledge of military tradition and inspiring courage. After the official proceedings, James and Tommy were given time to speak privately. The boy was bursting with questions about palace life, military history, and James's experiences as a guard. What struck James most was Tommy's continued concern for whether James had gotten into serious trouble. "Are you really okay?" Tommy asked seriously. "I've been worried about you all week. My mom said some people on the internet were arguing about whether you should have helped me or not." James knelt down to Tommy's level, just as he had a week earlier in the palace courtyard. "Tommy, I want you to listen to me carefully. What I did last week was the easiest decision I've ever made in my military career. Some people might disagree with breaking rules, but I would make the same choice again without hesitation." "Really?" "Really. And do you know why?" James asked. Tommy shook his head. "Because you reminded me why I became a soldier in the first place. It wasn't for the uniform or the ceremonies or even the honor. It was to help protect and serve people, especially those who need it most. You helped me remember that being a good soldier sometimes means being a good person first." The conversation was interrupted by Mark Henderson, who approached with tears in his eyes. "Sergeant Mitchell, I wanted you to know that Tommy has decided what he wants to be when he grows up." "Oh?" James asked, looking at Tommy with curiosity. Tommy's face broke into a huge grin. "I want to be a soldier who helps people, just like you. But first, I want to become a mechanical engineer so I can design better wheelchairs and mobility equipment for other kids like me. Then, I want to join the army and help people who need it." James felt his own eyes welling up with emotion. "That sounds like a perfect plan, Tommy. The army would be lucky to have someone like you." As the reception continued, James noticed something remarkable happening. The story of his interaction with Tommy had sparked conversations about the role of military personnel in society, the importance of accessibility for people with disabilities, and the power of small acts of kindness to create positive change. Several charities, focused on supporting military families and children with disabilities, had reported significant increases in donations and volunteer applications following the viral video. A foundation had been established in Tommy's name to provide wheelchair, repairs, and replacements for families who couldn't afford them. Military units around the world had begun implementing new guidelines about when breaking protocol might be appropriate for humanitarian reasons. The most surprising development came when Colonel Whitmore approached James near the end of the reception. "Sergeant Mitchell, I have an interesting proposition for you. The Ministry of Defense has asked if you would be interested in a new position developing community outreach programs that bridge the gap between military service and civilian needs." James looked surprised. "Ma'am? Your actions last week demonstrated exactly the kind of thinking we need to make military service more relevant and connected to the communities we serve. It would mean a promotion, specialized training, and the opportunity to create programs that prevent situations like Tommy's from happening in the future. I'm honored by the offer, ma'am, but I love being a Queen's Guard." Colonel Whitmore smiled. "You would still maintain your guard duties, but you'd also have the opportunity to expand your service in ways that clearly align with your instincts and values." As the afternoon drew to a close, Tommy's family prepared to leave. The boy had collected autographs, taken pictures, and accumulated enough memories to last a lifetime. But before they left, he had one more surprise for James. "Sergeant Mitchell, I wrote you a letter," Tommy said, pulling out a carefully folded piece of paper. "I wanted to thank you properly." James unfolded the letter and read it silently. Written in Tommy's careful handwriting was a message that would stay with him forever. Dear Sergeant Mitchell, thank you for showing me that heroes aren't just people in stories. They're real people who choose to help others, even when it's hard. You made my dream come true. But more than that, you made me believe that I can make other people's dreams come true too. I hope someday I can be as brave and kind as you. Your friend, Tommy Henderson. 6 months later, James was featured in a documentary about modern military service alongside Tommy, who had become something of a celebrity advocate for disability rights and accessibility. The documentary showed James in his new role, working with communities across the UK to create programs that brought military personnel and civilians together for mutual support and understanding. Tommy, meanwhile, had started a blog about his experiences living with spina bifida and his dream of becoming a soldier engineer. His story had inspired countless other children with disabilities to pursue their dreams despite obstacles, and his advocacy work had led to real changes in accessibility policies at government buildings and tourist attractions across the country. The final scene of the documentary showed James and Tommy meeting again at the palace gates exactly 1 year after their first encounter. This time, Tommy's wheelchair was equipped with advanced modifications he had helped design, and James wore the uniform of his expanded role in community outreach. As they stood together where it all began, Tommy looked up at his friend and asked, "Do you ever regret breaking the rules that day?" James looked out at the crowd of tourists, many of whom now knew the story of the guard who chose compassion over protocol, and smiled. "Tommy, that day taught me that the best rules are the ones that help us take care of each other. Breaking a small rule to follow a bigger one about helping people? That's not something I regret. That's something I'm proud of for the rest of my life." The story of Sergeant James Mitchell and Tommy Henderson became more than just a viral video or a feel-good news story. It became a reminder that in a world often focused on following procedures and maintaining order, the most important moments often happen when someone chooses to prioritize human kindness over institutional rules. And sometimes those moments change not just the lives of the people directly involved, but the hearts and minds of everyone who witnesses them.